Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. There was a man in his middle years who was on a Caribbean cruise. On the first day out, he noticed an attractive woman about his age who smiled at him in a friendly way as he passed her on the deck, which pleased him. That night, he managed to get seated at the same table with her for dinner. As the conversation developed, he commented that he had seen her on the deck that day and had appreciated her friendly smile. When she heard this, she smiled again and commented, "Well, the reason I smiled was that when I saw you, I was immediately struck by your strong resemblance to my third husband." At this, the man's ears picked up and he said, "Oh, how many times have you been married?" She looked down at her plate, smiled demurely, and answered, "Twice." That's about as good a definition of hope as I have found. Hope involves not only a wish, but also an expectation. Hope anticipates fulfillment, and hope uplifts our lives. Max Lucado has a meditation called simply Hope. He writes, "It's one of the most compelling narratives in all of Scripture. So fascinating is the scene, in fact, that Luke opted to record it in detail. Two disciples are walking down the dusty road to the village of Emmaus. Their talk concerns the crucified Jesus. Their words come slowly, trudging in cadence with their dirge-like pace of their feet. 'I can hardly believe it. He's gone. What do we do now? It's Peter's fault. He shouldn't have.' Just then a stranger comes up from behind and says, 'I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhear you. Who are you discussing?' They stop and turn. Other travelers make their way around them as the three stand in silence. Finally, one of them asks, 'Where have you been in the last few days? Haven't you heard about Jesus of Nazareth?' And he continued to tell what has happened. This scene fascinates me. Two sincere disciples telling how the last nail had been driven in Israel's coffin. God, in disguise, listens patiently, his wounded hands buried deeply in his robe. He must have been touched at the faithfulness of this pair. Yet he also must have been a bit chagrined. He had just gone to hell and back to give heaven to earth, and these two were worried about the political situation of Israel. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, they said. But we had hoped. How often have you heard a phrase like that? We were hoping the doctor would release him. I had hoped to pass the exam. We had hoped the surgery would get all the tumor. I hoped the job was in the bag. Words painted gray with disappointment. What we wanted didn't come. What came, we didn't want. The result, shattered hope. The foundation of our world trembles. We trudge up the road to Emmaus, dragging our sandals in the dust, wondering what we did to deserve such a plight. What kind of God would let me down like this? And yet so tear-filled are our eyes, and so limited is our perspective, that God could be the fellow walking next to us and we wouldn't even know it. You see, the problem with our two heavy-hearted friends was not a lack of faith, but a lack of vision. Their petitions were limited to what they could imagine, an earthly kingdom. Had God answered their prayer, had he granted their hope, the violence in the Mideast would have started 2,000 years earlier, and Jesus would have spent the next 40 years training his disciples to be cabinet members. So you have to wonder if God's most merciful act is his refusal to answer some of our prayers. We are not much different than burdened travelers, are we? We roll in the mud of self-pity in the very shadow of the cross. We piously ask for his will and then have the audacity to pout if everything doesn't go our way. we would just remember the heavenly body that awaits us. We'd stop complaining that he hasn't healed this earthly one. Our problem is not so much that God doesn't give us what we hope for, as it is that we don't know the right thing for which to hope. Let me say that again. Our problem is not so much that God doesn't give us what we hope for, as it is that we don't know the right thing for which to hope. Hope is not what you expect. It is what you would never dream. It's a wild, improbable tale with a pinch me, I'm dreaming ending. It's Abraham adjusting his bifocals so he can see not his grandson, but his son. It's Moses standing in the promised land, not with Aaron or Miriam at his side, but with Elijah and the transfigured Christ. It's Zechariah left speechless at the sight of his wife Elizabeth, gray-headed and pregnant. And it is the two Emmaus-bound pilgrims reaching out to take a piece of bread, only to see the hands from which it is offered are pierced. Hope is not a granted wish or a favor performed. No, it is greater than that. It is a zany, unpredictable dependence on a God who loves to surprise us out of our socks and be there in the flesh to see our reaction. Hope. It's a noun. It's a verb. It's a promise. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.